The Garden Beyond Time, Chapter 1. The fog in Winmere was a living thing, curling around lampposts like a cat seeking warmth. It muffled the gulls' cries and softened the edges of the stone cottages, as if the town existed half in memory. Elias Thorne stepped out of Thorn and Time, his fingers stained with oil, and inhaled the salt-heavy air. The shop sign creaked as its letters faded, but proud, swaying in the damp breeze that carried the sea's whispers. He glanced down Marrow Street, where Mrs. Penwell's shadow flickered behind the lace curtains, a silhouette sharp as her gossip. She was watching again. Let her, he thought. The garden was his alone. Winmere didn't appear on most maps, not because it was small, though it was, with barely 300 souls huddled against the cliffs, but because it was old. So old, the sea seemed to murmur its name in the crash of the waves, as if it recalled the tides curving space with its streets centuries ago. The town clung to the rugged coast, its cottages built from stone smoothed by time, their slate roofs slated against storms that arrived like uninvited guest, and left without apology. Elias loved its quiet, its stubborn refusal to bend to the world beyond. He lived here nearly all his 42 years, saved for a brief, restless stint in a city whose clamor he'd fled, vowing never to return. Thorn and Time sat at the center of Marrow Street, a narrow shop with windows that caught the sea's glint like polished mirrors. Inside, clocks ticked in an uneven chorus. Grandfather clocks with deep, resonant bellows, mantel clocks with delicate chimes, pocket watches that whispered secrets only Elias could hear. He repaired them all, his hands moving with the steady grace of the tides. Some in Winmere jested he'd been born with the watchmaker's loop in one eye and gears for fingers, a quip he neither confirmed nor denied. He took broken timepieces gently, as if they were wounded birds, and returned them when they were right again, not necessarily sooner. Time, he believed, couldn't be rushed any more than a wound could be forced to heal. The townsfolk trusted him. Though they didn't know him, Elias was polite but distant, his smiles rare and his words rarer still. He listened to their stories. The butcher's grumbles about rising costs, Leah, the baker's pride in her new rye loaf, Jonah the sailor's tales of storms that had nearly claimed him, but offered little to himself. Only Miss Penwell, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, seemed to suspect he held secrets. "You're too quiet, Elias Thorne," she said once, her cane tapping the cobblestone like a metronome. "Quiet men hide things." He'd only smiled, letting the fog swallow her words, but her gaze lingered in his mind like a splinter. That evening, as the sun dipped below the cliffs, painting the sky in brushed purples and golds, Elias locked the shop's heavy oak door. The key turned with a satisfying click, and he paused, listening to the gulls' distant cries. The air was thick with salt and the faint sweetness of lavender, which grew wild along the path to his cottage. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on gravel, his shadows stretching long and thin in the fading light. His cottage was small, tucked behind a shop like an afterthought, its walls weathered by years of sea wind. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and old paper. The rooms, lit by a single lamp that cast warm pools on the table where a half-finished cuckoo clock waited, its wooden bird silent, its gears exposed like the innards of a dream. Elias set the lamp beside the clock but didn't touch it. His mind was elsewhere, drawn to the place he visited only when the town slept. He moved to the back door, its frame wrapped by years of damp and steeped, and stepped into the narrow yard where the world seemed to hold its breath. The hedge loomed before him, a tangle of green so dense it merged with the earth, unbroken except for a gate few would notice. Honeysuckle wove through its iron bars, their blooms heavy with sweetness, their petals glowing faintly in the dusk. To anyone else, it was just a hedge, a forgotten corner of Winmere's tangled greenery, but Elias knew better. He pushed through the gate, its hinges silent despite their rust, and stepped into the garden beyond time. The air changed instantly, thicker, warmer, as if the fog dared not follow. The scent of honeysuckle deepened, mingled with earth and something older, like the memory of rain on ancient stone. Ivy spilled over stone paths, curling around rusted dials and shattered clock faces, half buried in the soil. Their hands froze at impossible hours. A sundial stood at an angle, its shadow creeping backward, defying the sun's descent. Roses bloomed in reverse, their petals folding into buds with a soft, deliberate grace, while lilies drooped with the weight of years, though Elias had planted them only weeks ago. A pendulum hung in the air, suspended by nothing, unmoving yet humming, with a potential that made his skin prickle, as if it waited for a hand to set it free. At the garden's heart, beneath a curtain of vines that shimmered like ink, stood a clock unlike any other. Its face was etched with symbols Elias couldn't read, spirals, stars, lines that seemed to shift when he blinked. Its hands ticked counterclockwise, each movement was soft rebellion against the world's rhythm. The clock was warm to the touch, its pulse faint but steady, like a heartbeat buried deep. Elias knelt before it, brushing away leaves that had fallen since his last visit. He found it years ago after his mother's death, when grief had driven him to wander places he shouldn't. The garden had been here then, waiting, though he hadn't understood its purpose. He still didn't, not fully. But he felt its rhyme, a cadence older than Winmere, older than the sea. Tonight, something was different. A new bloom had appeared near the clock, a flower he didn't recognize, its petals translucent, glowing faintly like moonlight caught in glass. It stood alone, its stems slender, unyielding, rooted in soil that sparkled with flecks of quartz. Elias reached for it, his fingers hovering an inch away, then drew back. The garden had rules, though it never spoke them. Touch too quickly, and it might pull you somewhere you weren't ready to go. He stood, the air heavy with honeysuckle and salt, and listening. The garden was watching, its silence louder than the clocks in his shop. He lingered longer than he meant to, tracing the paths where ivy whispered against his boots, The backward clock ticked softly, counting moments no one else could hear. Elias felt its pull, a quiet call to stay, to unravel its secrets. But the night was growing cold, and Winmere would wake soon, its routines unbroken by the garden's strangeness. He stepped back through the gate, the honeysuckle brushing his shoulder like a farewell, and closed it behind him. The fog greeting him wrapped the world in its familiar haze. Back in his cottage, Elias opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages worn smooth by years of handling. He started it long ago, after his first dream of the garden, though he couldn't recall why. The earliest entries were in his mother's handwriting, sketches of gears, notes about time's weight, but his own words filled the latter pages. He dipped a pen in ink and wrote, "New bloom near the backward clock, petals like glass, glowing. The air feels heavier tonight, as if something is waking." Paused, the pen hovering, then added, "Mrs. Penwell is watching again. She knows more than she says." He closed the journal and set it aside, his gaze drifting to the window. The fog had thickened, swallowing the cliffs and the sea beyond. Somewhere in the garden, the backwards clock continued its silent count, its hands moving against time's flow. Elias felt its rhythm in his bones, a pulse that matched his own. He extinguished the lamp, the room falling into darkness, and lay down, the cottage creaking softly around him. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it carried the scent of honeysuckle and the echoing of ticking gears. Outside, the fog curled tighter around Winmere, guarding its secrets, and in the garden, the glowing bloom pulsed once faintly, as if it knew he would return. Chapter 2. Clocks Beneath the Ivy. Elias woke with a taste of honeysuckle on his tongue. The garden's scent lingered like a dream that refused to fade. The cottage was quiet, save for a soft creak of the floorboards settling under the weight of morning. He lay still, staring at the ceiling where shadows dancing in the pale light filtering through the window. The fog outside was thinner today, a gossamer veil that softened Winmere's edge, but no longer hid them. He could hear the gulls, their cries sharp against the distant murmur of the sea, and the faint tick of the cuckoo clock on his table, its bird still silent, waiting for his hands to bring it to life. But his thoughts were not on the shop, nor on the clocks that awaited him. They were on the garden, on the glowing bloom he'd found last night, its petals like glass, and its backwards clock that seemed to hum with a secret it longed to share. He rose, his movements slow, and dressed in the same warm trousers and linen shirt he'd worn yesterday, the fabric soft against his skin. He pulled on his boots, the leather scuffed ones from years of walking Winmere's uneven paths, and stepped outside. The air was cold, carrying a tang of salt and the faint sweetness of lavender from the path. Elias paused, glancing towards Morrow Street, where the town was stirring. Elias' bakery chimney puffed smoke, the butcher's cart rattling down the cobblestones. Mrs. Penwell's curtains twitched, her shadow a silent accusation. He turned away, his boots crunching on gravel as he made his way to the hedge. The gate was as he had left it, the honeysuckle blooms closed now, their petals curled tight against the morning light. He pushed through the iron bars, cold under his touch, and he stepped into the garden. The change was immediate, as it always was. The air thickened, warm and heavy, like a breath held too long. The sound of Winmere faded, replaced by a stillness so deep it felt alive. Elias stood on the stone path, his eyes tracing the familiar strangeness of the garden. Ivy spilled over everything, a green tide that swallowed rusted dials and shattered clock faces. Their hands frozen at hours that made no sense. 3 o'clock, 7 o'clock, a time that couldn't exist. A sundial leaned to one side, its shadow creeping backward, defying the sun that now peeked through the fog. Roses folded into buds, their petals retreating as if time itself were unwinding, while lilies drooped, their stems heavy with years they shouldn't have borne. Elias walked deeper, his boots silent on the mossy stones. The pendulum hung in the air, its brass surface catching the light, unmoving yet humming with potential that made his skin prickle. He passed a cluster of violets that bloomed in reverse, their purple hearts closing as he approached, and a patch of soil where quartz flakes glittered like stars. The garden was a riddle, one he'd spent years trying to solve, though he suspected it didn't want to be solved. He wanted to be felt, to be heard. He wanted to be remembered. He reached the backward clock, its face half hidden beneath a curtain of vines that shimmered like ink in the morning light. The clock was larger than the others, its frame wrought iron, its face etched with symbols that seemed to shift when he looked too long, spirals, stars, lines that moved. Have been a language he'd forgotten. Its hands ticked counterclockwise, each movement a soft rebellion against the world's rhythm. Elias knelt, brushing away the vines, their leaves cool and slick under his fingers. The clock was warm, its pulse steady, like a heartbeat buried deep in the earth. He found it years ago, after his mother's death, when he was just a boy, lost in grief and wondering where he shouldn't. The garden had been here then, waiting, though he hadn't understood its purpose. He still did, not fully, but he felt its rhythm, a cadence older than Winmere, older than the sea. The glowing bloom he'd seen last night was still there, its petals translucent, pulsing faintly with a light that seemed to come from within. It stood alone, its stem slender but unyielding, rooted in soil that sparkled with quartz. Elias reached for it, then hesitated, remembering the garden's unspoken rules. Instead, he turned his attention to the clock. His fingers traced the symbols on his face, their edges worn smooth by time. He'd never wound it before. Something had always held him back, a quiet warning in the garden's hum. But today, the pull was stronger. The clock's pulse louder, as if it were calling him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small key he'd always carried, its brass tarnished but familiar. He inserted it into the clock's side, the mechanism clicking softly, and began to wind. The first turn was smooth. The gears inside shifted with a sigh. The second turn was heavier, as if the clock were resisting. On the third turn, a sudden dizziness swept through him, the garden shimmering like a mirage. The air thickened, pressing against his skin, and the ground beneath him seemed to tilt. Elias stumbled, catching himself on the clock, his breath coming fast. The garden blurred, colors bleeding into one another. Green ivy, purple violets, the glowing blooms light, until the world steadied, and he was somewhere else. He was in his mother's kitchen, the air warm with the scent of baking bread. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting the wooden table in gold. His mother stood at the corner, her hands dusted with flour, her laughter soft as she turned to him. "Elias, come here," she said, her voice a melody he hadn't heard in decades. He was small again, no more than 6, his hands sticky with dough as he climbed onto the stool beside her. She handed him a pocket watch, its face simple, its ticking steady. "Wind it gently," she said, guiding his fingers. "Time is patient, but it needs care." The memory was so vivid, so real, that Elias felt tears prick his eyes. He could smell the yeast, feel the warmth of her hands on his, hear the watch's soft tick as he turned the key. But then the kitchen shimmered, the sunlight fading, and he was back in the garden, kneeling before the backwards clock. His hands trembled. The clock's hand stopped, frozen, and an hour he couldn't read, and the glowing bloom pulsed once brighter, as if in acknowledgement. Elias sat back, his heart pounding. He'd relived a memory, a moment he hadn't thought of in years, buried beneath the weight of grief and time. The garden had peeled back a veil he hadn't known was there, showing him a piece of his past as clearly as if he'd stepped into it. But it wasn't just a memory. He felt it, a presence in the air, a gentle, guiding hand that wasn't his mother's. The garden had shown him this, but why? He stood, his legs unsteady, and looked around. The garden was unchanged, the ivy still spilled, the roses still folded, the pendulum still hummed, but it felt different, as if it were watching him more closely now. He touched the backboard clock again, its warmth lingered on his fingertips, and realized something he hadn't before. Time, in this garden, could be touched, but not without consequence. Elias left the garden, the gate closing behind him with a soft click. The fog greeted him, cool and familiar, and Winmere's sound returned, the gulls, the cart, the faint hum of life. He walked back to his cottage, his mind racing, and went straight to the drawer where he kept the journal. He opened it, flipping past his mother's sketches and his own early entries until he found a blank page. He dipped his pen in ink and wrote, "Wound the backwards clock. It showed me mother, the kitchen, the watch. The garden remembers, but it's more than memory. Something is guiding me." He paused, the pen hovering, then added, "The bloom pulses brighter after. I think the garden is waking." He closed the journal and sat back, his gaze drifting to the window. The fog had thickened again, wrapping Winmere in silence. Somewhere in the garden, the backward clock ticked, counting moments no one could hear. Elias felt its rhythm in his bones, a pulse that matched his own. He knew he'd return tomorrow, and the day after that. The garden had shown him a piece of his past, but it held more secrets he wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. Outside, the fog curled tighter around Winmere, guarding its mysteries, and in the garden, the glowing bloom pulsed again, faintly, as if it knew he would be back.